Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we're lucky to have Alan with us here tonight to give us a talk on his latest new title, Intervention, which we have with a 10% discount on tonight. Alan has written many titles over the years, and so we're fortunate to have him speaking with us tonight. So thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here down in London to be able to talk a little bit about intervention, and especially nice to be here because this is one of my favourite shops in the world. Intervention is my latest book, but really it's the culmination of two other books which I need to mention very briefly before we talk about intervention itself. 6 or 7 years ago I published a book with a co-author called Christopher Knight, which was entitled Civilization 1. That was a book we wrote because we had come across in our respective previous research the most fantastic measuring system from prehistory. For me it started out on the island of Crete with a device called the Phaistos disc. For Chris it started out with Freemasonry, but we came upon a unit of measurement which is called the megalithic yard, which I guess quite a lot of readers of esoterica and ancient history will be familiar with. The megalithic yard was a unit of measurement which was used in the construction of the megalithic monuments such as Stonehenge, Avebury, and almost all the megalithic monuments from the north of Scotland right down into France show the use of this unit. It was rediscovered by Professor Alexander Thom, who actually was an engineer and a professor of engineering at Oxford University, and it fell out of his research when he was measuring very carefully a lot of the standing stone circles and stone alignments that had been left from the megalithic period. The megalithic yard he pronounced to be 2.722 feet or 82.966 centimetres in length. Alexander Thom has gone down in history as being probably the father of archaeoastronomy. Everybody, experts alike, agree that the man was an absolute genius when it came to understanding what the megalithic monuments were for in an astronomical sense. But his ideas regarding the megalithic yard have been somewhat poo-pooed. The reason being that what he was in effect saying was a standard unit of measurement was used up to 5,000 years ago, was in operation for 2,000 years and never differed by more than about 1 part in 10,000 during all that period. And of course what experts want to know is how would it be possible for that unit of measurement to stay so accurate across such a long period of time. And that's what Chris and I were trying to do. We were trying to redeem Alexander Thom's reputation and to find out how the megalithic yard was established, what it was, and why it was being used. Well, it's a very long story, but to cut a very long story short, what we went on to discover was the megalithic yard was part of something much bigger. First of all, it was defined by use of a very simple device, a pendulum, and by an observation of the planet Venus. And it was against the background of a type of geometry which differed somewhat from the geometry we use today. Instead of having 360 degrees to the circle, megalithic geometry had 366 degrees. Now this was something that I'd previously come across through my research in Crete, and when we applied it to the megalithic monuments of Great Britain, by a process of elimination we were able to show eventually not only how the megalithic yard had come into being, but just how much genius had gone into the whole system. Because the megalithic system of measurement covers time and space and distance and mass. It's an all-encompassing system, and it's tied irrevocably to the size of the Earth and to the mass of the Earth. And I just need to mention very briefly how that works. In the megalithic system of geometry, it has minutes, seconds and degrees, the same as modern geometry. In megalithic geometry, there are 6 seconds of arc to a minute of arc of the circumference of the Earth. There are 60 megalithic minutes of arc to a degree, and there are 366 degrees to the circle. Now when we take the circle of the Earth, the polar circle of the Earth, we find that 366 megalithic yards equals 1 megalithic second of arc, and it works up from that. Also, we discovered that the method of measurement in terms of mass and volume that we used up until the advent of the metric system also specifically arose out of the megalithic system. Now, all of this was very interesting, and the book Civilization 1 turned out to be quite popular. But we were left with a little bit of an embarrassing situation that we couldn't deal with in the book. We knew that the megalithic yard was geodetic. We knew that it was designed to fit in a very specific way into the polar circumference of the Earth. What we tripped over by accident was that this unit of measurement did exactly the same thing when applied to the circumference of the Moon. And we couldn't understand how this could possibly be the case. And it worked in a way that 366 megalithic yards equals 1 megalithic second of arc of the Earth, and on the Moon 100 megalithic yards equaled 1 megalithic second of arc of the Moon. This caused us to look much more closely at the Moon than we had ever done before, and we did so at just the same time as scientists were starting to understand just how significant the Moon was to the Earth and to life upon it. It turns out that in almost every imaginable way, without the Moon being what it is and where it is, we wouldn't be here. There would be no life on Earth. I would certainly not be giving this talk, and you wouldn't be listening to it, because the most rudimentary forms of life depended entirely upon the Moon being what it is and where it is. This is because, well, it's for a whole host of reasons, but it's basically because the Moon is huge in comparison with the Earth, compared with other moons of the solar system. It's 1/3 the size of the Earth. In fact, it fits into the circumference of the Earth 3.66 times. And although it's not very massive, it doesn't have a great deal of mass, it's only 1/81st part of the mass of the Earth. It has a tremendously perceptible effect on the Earth. Everybody knows that the Moon affects tides, for example, but the Moon doesn't just move water, the Moon moves land as well. And it's beginning to be realised now that the whole topic of plate tectonics, the whole way the surface of the Earth moves about, allowing an even amount of vulcanisation to take place across the surface of the Earth, is thanks to the Moon, and certainly to the more primitive Moon, because at one time the Moon was much closer to the Earth than it is now. The Moon has slowed the Earth in its orbit. The Moon has held the Earth to a certain angle relative to the Sun, by which the Earth gets an even warming from the Sun. The Moon, because of its attraction, has prevented the Earth from constantly tipping over, because the Earth is a very unstable planet with a very fluid metal core. The Moon has, as I said, allowed volcanoes to go off evenly across the Earth, which hasn't happened on other planets. But it's also prevented the surface of the Earth from becoming too thick, as it has done on Venus and as it has done on Mars. And if we want life on a planet, we need constant recycling of minerals and metals from the centre of the planet to the outside of the planet. And these, because of plate tectonics forming mountains being weathered down, and weather, again, essentially a lunar effect. The weathering takes the minerals into rivers, the rivers go into the sea builds up this tremendous chemical soup in which life first spawned, and which ultimately led to us being here. So in every way, shape or form, the Moon is absolutely vital. But it didn't stop there. We then went on to realise that there is no real theory as to how the Moon came into existence. The only theory that is pushed out by science at the moment is called the giant impact theory, or the big whack theory. And that suggests that a planet about the size of Mars made contact with the Earth early in the Earth's existence, and that material was ejected from the Earth at that time, and that it was that material that eventually circled the Earth and then coalesced to make the Moon. The only reason that this theory is still being trotted out is because it's the only theory that there is. but it's a very difficult theory to accept for all sorts of reasons, not least of all the fact that the mass of the Earth is only the mass of the Moon is only 1/81st part that of the Earth. If there had been a sizable collision with the Earth and matter had been moved away from the Earth to form another planetoid like the Moon, then the Moon should have had the same relative mass as the Earth. In other words, it should have had the ions and the other heavy metals which we find inside the Earth, and it doesn't. The Moon is made almost entirely of basalt rock, very light volcanic rock, and this is almost impossible to explain. All sorts of tortured experiments are carried out with regard to the giant impact theory to do with the Earth's spin, which again is not answered by this issue. We know that Moon rock is the same as Earth rock because the oxygen isotope signature is exactly the same. So it must have developed in the same part of space. But then we start to look at the Moon in terms of the clues it gives us as to its identity. There are 3 specific numbers associated with the Earth and the Moon that crop up time and again in terms of the Earth's orbit, the Earth's size relative to both the Earth and the Sun. In fact, every aspect of the Moon's relationship with the Earth responds to 3 specific numbers and their multiples and divisions. Those numbers are 366, 27.322 and 400. Now all of those numbers relate to each other in a tripart series. By involving 2 of those numbers you always arrive at a multiple or a division of the third. This is a situation that you might find happening by chance once in relation with the Earth and the Moon, but as we wrote in our book Who Built the Moon, you shouldn't get it occurring 20, 30 or more times. So again, to cut a very long story short, we were left believing that the Moon had to be artificial. The Moon had to have been engineered. Not only was it engineered, but whoever had engineered it had done it thoughtfully enough to leave all sorts of messages, mathematical messages in the Moon and in the Moon-Earth relationship, which ultimately could not be ignored. The most important of these messages, of course, are solar and lunar eclipses, those times when the face of the Moon covers the face of the Sun. It does so exactly. Isaac Asimov once said, "This is the most incredible situation in space imaginable." Carl Sagan said, "I prefer to ignore the existence of the Moon. It's just too unusual for words. Better to pretend it doesn't exist at all." The idea of a total eclipse is outrageous. It only works because the Moon is exactly 1/400th part the size of the Sun, and because it orbits the Earth 1/400th part of the distance between the Earth and the Sun. An eclipse is a line of sighted effect, but a total eclipse is utterly beyond belief. And of course we've got the number 400 again, 400, 4000, 40, which crops up time and again with regard to the relationship with the Sun and the Moon. Now I must push on because I'm supposed to be here to be talking about this book, Intervention. Chris and I were left with 3 alternative theories as to who might have created the Moon. After an awful lot of discussion, we said either it had to be, in our estimation, either God, it had to be altruistic aliens, or it had to be humanity itself. Now, we decided that we couldn't realistically look at the idea of God having done it because, for one reason, because from a scientific point of view, and we always try to remain within the realms of science, we cannot prove scientifically that God exists, but also because it occurred to us, both Chris and I are believers, but it also occurred to us that the Moon had quite clearly been created as an afterthought. It wasn't there at the beginning of the solar system. It was put there to make the Earth operate in the way the Earth does. And we said to ourselves, if God had done it, God would have got the situation right in the first place and no kind of afterthought would have been necessary. So, and I'm paraphrasing because time is of the essence here. So then we thought about altruistic aliens, and we decided Well, there's no absolute proof that aliens exist either. Lots of people report having seen them, but there's no definitive proof. The chances against aliens actually having come to Earth, having developed in a part of the cosmos close enough to us at the same time as us, is infinitesimally small, and there is no irrefutable evidence. But using Occam's razor, we do know that human beings exist. We do know that human beings have existed in the past, and it's a fair bet, unless we somehow wipe ourselves out, that human beings will also exist in the future. And so we finished Who Built the Moon, deciding that of the three, we thought it was most likely that human beings were responsible for having created the moon. That's where Chris and my work went to. And then, latterly, I sat down and decided this wasn't enough. I, at least, had to put my money where my mouth is. Krista went off to do other things, and I decided that the time had come to really look closely at the possibility of what I called intervention. I could see, not just through my work with Chris, but through all of my books going back over the last nearly 30 years, that the world is filled with all sorts of historical puzzles which go right back to the dawn of time, all of which deserve an answer and none of which really find one. I'm knocking on now, so I grew up at a time when books by Eric von Daniken, for example, were very popular. Eric von Daniken was sure that the Earth had been visited in the past by aliens, and that aliens had a tremendous part to play in humanity. But I said to myself, if it was human beings that built the moon, then maybe it was also human beings that intervened with humanity right from the start. And then that caused me to look at the possibility of time travel, of course, because if people from the future are going to affect people from the past, or the Earth from the past, they have to be able to travel in time. And the more I looked, the more I began to realise that there is nothing in the laws of physics which prevents time travel. What physics seemed to prevent, by way of a very brilliant man who leaves me absolutely speechless with his mathematics, a man called Novikov, Alexander Novikov. We can, theoretically, go back in time. There's nothing to prevent us from doing so. What we can't do is to go back in time and do anything that wasn't done, because the probability of that happening in terms of physics and quantum physics is zero. So we can't contradict what's known as the grandfather paradox. We cannot go back in time to when our grandfather was a child and shoot him and kill him, because otherwise we wouldn't exist. And because the probability is so remote, it couldn't happen. On the other hand, let's turn the paradox on his head and say, supposing that when our grandfather was a little boy, he was walking along the road one day and he was about to be hit by a passing truck or train, and that somebody pushed him out of the way and saved his life. And let's suppose that that person was us, was me. That being the case, the paradox is turned on its head. Grandfather could not have survived, I could not have been born, unless I had gone back in time to push grandfather out of the way of the oncoming vehicle. So the grandfather paradox can be used in both directions. Let us say then that human beings did go back in time. Let us say that they went back in time 4.6 billion years and that it was they who created the moon. How did they do it? Well, it seems a tremendous thing to build a planet, but the amazing thing is, from an engineering point of view, we're not really all that far away from it now. Building the moon isn't really the difficult problem. Going back in time is the problem. If you can send robotic craft back in time, then building the moon is not too complicated a business. For all sorts of reasons which I can't go into now because I don't have the time, I'm convinced that the moon was built with material that came from the asteroid belt. Nearly all the asteroid belt exists between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. The asteroid belt is composed of many fragments. It used to be thought that they had originally represented a planet and that the planet had somehow disintegrated. The latest idea is that it never got to be a planet because Jupiter's gravity was too great. Be that as it may, it is known from computer modelling that it must have once contained a great amount of basaltic rock. Now, every other kind of rock imaginable still exists in the belt, in the asteroid belt. The one kind of rock that doesn't exist is basaltic rock, exactly the same kind of rock of which the Moon is made. Most of that basaltic rock had been reduced in the asteroid belt to a very fine state because of the interaction over, it's a fact, it's been proven, which says that if small enough debris orbits around the Sun in the way the small debris in the asteroid belt once did, ultimately, because of the effects of sunlight and the photonic presence of sunlight, it will eventually spiral in, slowly but surely, towards the Sun. All it would have taken, therefore, would have been a collecting device somewhere in the orbit of the Earth, which collected this material together, and then it would coalesce, and eventually it would become the Moon. That would be added to by further basaltic rock from the surface of the Earth, which would eventually make the shape of the Moon that we have today. There are many reasons for believing this to be the case, which I can't talk about tonight. But what is most important is, if we were to know that the Moon was an artificial object, and that one day we would have to create that object in order that life could exist on the Earth, we would need to be informed of this in all sorts of ways. Our attention would need to be drawn to it. So we have the mathematics which is involved in the Earth-Moon-Sun relationship. That's one thing. But getting people to accept that is dependent upon them looking in the first place. If we are going to really get people to think, what we have to do is we have to go back in time, not just to build a moon, but to leave messages in bottles. We have to leave enigmas in our ancient past and in our more recent past that are so incredible that we're going to look at them very, very closely and say, how on earth could this have been done? I talk about things like the huge stones at Baalbek in Lebanon, which are so big in the temple platform that even the world's biggest modern crane could not move one, let alone bring it from a quarry to the site where it is, which is up a steep gradient. I speak about the Great Pyramid of Cheops, which supposedly was built within 20 years. If that was the case, bearing in mind it contains 2.5 million stone blocks, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, through all seasons of the year, a block of stone would have had to have been lifted into place on the pyramid every 4 minutes. The suggestion is utterly preposterous. The lightest of the stones in question weighed 2.5 tons. To get them up that incline, to build that pyramid in 20 years would have been utterly impossible. There are other anomalies in history for which there's no satisfactory explanation. Again, I don't have the time to go into detail, but let me just look at one of them, for example. Man's use of metals, smelting of metal. There is no theory in anthropology that can explain how humanity ever came to be able to smelt metal. To smelt the softest metals takes huge temperatures, temperatures which never occur naturally in a place where human beings could be. So, for example, it can happen in volcanoes, but human beings don't go very near volcanoes if they've got any sense, and our ancient ancestors certainly would have not done so. It can only be done by controlling fire, which human beings could have learned to do, and then by bringing that fire up to a tremendous temperature at which metal will melt. The hardest thing is to find out how it possibly could have been done in the first place, when nobody could possibly have conceived of it because they hadn't seen metal. Again, that's just one example. I want to talk very, very briefly about UFOs, the incidence of UFOs, and the fact that we see UFOs. UFOs are usually attributed to alien intervention. There are so many sightings in the world that cannot be explained. that we can't put them all down to misguided people or charlatans or mistaken people. There is always going to be a large percentage of UFO sightings which cannot be explained. My belief is, and it's pointed out in the book in detail, that what we are seeing is deliberate interventions from the future. And as much as anything else, these interventions are designed specifically to keep us looking, to keep our attention focused on what's odd, what's unusual, to keep us looking in history. It's to make people like me write books like this, and it's to make other people who are interested look at these books. I see myself as being nothing more than one link in a very long chain. It's quite likely that quite a few people, I hope, will read this book, that this book will go out of fashion, that somebody may pick it up in another generation, that somebody may write a similar book, that one day maybe a scientist will look with more favour on these kind of theories. But none of this would happen if it wasn't for these wonders from the past, for these strange anomalies, things that are found deep in mines which shouldn't be there, creatures even from prehistoric eras which quite clearly were shot with bullets from guns, all manner of peculiar things that have happened in the past, which have often been put down to alien intervention, but which could just as easily be intervention of human beings from the future. I know that this is probably the strangest book that I will ever write. I know that a lot of people will call me a crank and a lunatic for writing it. But sometimes the most unusual and the strangest things in life turn out to be the truest things. And what I ask of readers and critics alike is what Chris Knight and I have always asked, and that is, don't believe what we say. Look at the mathematics, look at our numbers, and what we want people to do, and I've always wanted people to do, is to come back and tell us where we are wrong. I have to say, it hasn't happened once in nearly 20 years. We get our books tested and checked very carefully by some really clever mathematicians and physicists before we put these things into print. So, if that's the case, why won't scientists take notice of what we're saying in Civilization 1, in Who Built the Moon, and in Intervention? I think it was put best by Robert Graves in his book The White Goddess, and he finished by saying, these are the kind of, I paraphrase him, these are the kind of ideas that scientists won't at this moment in time accept, because they dare not accept it even though they cannot reject it. And I think what we're looking at is a situation where scientists feel they are committing professional suicide to look at these kind of matters. And this bookshop is filled with all sorts of things which scientists should be looking at more honestly. And let's hope Providence allows for the fact that one day they will. Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them. Yes?
If I'm not wrong, you said that there are sometimes like human beings come in spaceships.
Yes.
So people like us can look up and in a way wonder about the oddity of the moon.
Yes.
But these people, if they got the technology
Yes.
to come and visit us, they
Yes.
certainly have they know how to, I don't know, if they want us to know about
Yes.
the oddity of the moon, I'm sure they got ways to make that clear.
This is the peculiarity of time travel, and it's the hardest thing. It was the hardest thing for me to understand, and it still puzzles me, although I am assured by my physicist friend that it's true. People from the future can certainly go back and build the moon because the moon is there. People from the future can certainly come back and create, for example, the Roswell incident or anything else. They can go back in time and shoot a bison and leave a bullet hole in its skull so that that bullet will be found, because those things were done. What people from the future cannot do is to go back in time and do anything that wasn't done. So, from a physics perspective, the reason that they cannot come and tell us that the moon is artificial and that they're from the future is because they haven't yet done it. Now, it could well be that that situation will change tomorrow. It could well be that the 12th of the 12th is the day that our future ancestors will turn up on the White House lawn and tell us. But that can only happen if it's in the time frame, if it has happened.
If it's in future history.
Yes, yes. And that is the hardest thing to understand. All the people from the future can do is look at their history, which is also our history, look at things that have happened in that history and say, we must have been involved there. And then they can go back and do it, because there's a door for them to go through. What they cannot do is go back and do something that wasn't done, because there is no door for them to enter. The physical probability of them being able to do it is zero, and so therefore they will not even set off on the journey. I think they do all sorts of other things. For example, I'm beginning to realise now, you know, the classic alien, the classic grey alien with a big head and the slanty eyes and what have you. I'm beginning to think that kind of classic alien is probably what I would call an avatar. It's probably a biological robot, for want of a better word. And I think they are probably controlled by people in the future. Past travel, time travel, is always going to be a fiercely expensive and very, very difficult thing to do. And it may well be that even in the longer term future, journeys to the past will be fairly limited because it's so expensive, because it's so dangerous. But it would be possible to put machines back in the past, and it would be possible, I'm assured again, to keep contact with those and to keep contact with these biological robots, which we see as being aliens. They would be biologically created so that they could survive over long distances, so that they could procreate, but they would be, in a sense, empty, in that they would be being controlled by people from the future. And this is the kind of technology that we are now beginning to harness in all sorts of ways. Not across time, but we can certainly do it across space now. It's only a matter of time before we do it across time. But as to the answer to your question, it can't happen yet because it hasn't happened. And yet it happens. You know, what do people say about quantum physics? Anyone who claims to understand quantum physics has never understood it at all, or doesn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
The only way I can do it is by analogy. For example, supposing I go back in time. When I'm younger, I'm walking up a hill, right? It's foggy, and I don't know it, but in the fog ahead of me there's a precipice. I see a sign. The sign says danger, precipice. So I turn back. I don't fall off the cliff, so therefore I'm not killed. Later on in the future, I have the opportunity to go back in time. I go back in time, I climb the hill on a nice sunny day, and I leave a sign there. Now that sign is the sign that will ultimately tell me not to fall off the cliff. Yet I put the sign there before I even climbed the hill. What matters as far as the time frame is concerned is the sequence of events. The solar system is made, including the Earth. The moon appears. The moon creates the circumstances upon which life can develop upon the Earth, and then life ultimately develops. In terms of the sequence, it doesn't matter to the life where the moon came from. The fact is that it is there when it is needed, as the sign was there when I needed it. Now I can't pretend to tell you absolutely how that is not an irrevocable paradox.
Yes, yes.
But I believe it isn't.
Does that not mean we're sort of bootstrapping into existence? I mean,
Yes.
Well, you know, originally when the moon wasn't there,
Yes.
the solar system must have just been sort of devoid of life.
Yes.
So where did we come from?
The future.
How would we have? Oh, I see. Right. Right.
You know, we live our lives in the expectation and the belief that time always has to be linear. It doesn't seem to occur to us that it might go around in circles or spirals, or that it might be possible to go back beyond that period. Now, one of the great drawbacks that some physicists say to time travel is, yes, you can go back in time, but you can't go back in time any further than the manufacture of your time machine, for all sorts of reasons that I don't entirely understand. But when I spoke to a physicist about my idea about us creating the moon, he said, oh no, that's okay, you can do that, because the moon's there, and the moon has been there all that time. And the mechanism which created the moon, for all I know, is still encased inside the moon. You know, there's something very peculiar about the inside of the moon that scientists really don't understand. It has even been suggested that the moon is hollow. And again, according to Carl Sagan, if that's the case, something really weird has been going on, because there is no physical mechanism for a hollow planet. So a lot depends on not necessarily accepting that time has to be linear. But I understand why it's difficult. And I get these difficulties fired at me every day from all over the world. And I can only say to these people, it's possible that time doesn't work in the way we think it works. You know, if you look back on the history of science, it's possible a lot of things didn't happen in the way we thought they happened. We thought that diseases were caused by vapours or miasmas. People were dropping like flies all over this city. And until Dr. John Snow in Soho discovered what was really going on and set the seeds of what would eventually be an understanding of bacteria. So every successive generation adds to what the generation before has done. That will almost certainly be true in our comprehension of how time works. But I do know also that people either can accept this or they can't, because I have many people, or I have some people still, who write to me and say, I really enjoyed the book, I thought it was a really good novel, but I can't make myself believe it. But I'm not asking for an act of faith, I'm asking for an act of scientific possibility. But I know it's problematical. Thank you. Yes?
Sorry.
No.
Just one more question.
Do.
So, the pyramids
Yeah.
are built by the people from the future. That's what you said.
I think that the people from the future assisted in the building
So
of
why
the
they
pyramid.
left our planet in the first place? So they built something so majestic and they left.
They built the pyramids purely and simply. Now this is going to sound terribly arrogant, but it's not intended to. They built the pyramids purely and simply so that you can sit there and ask me the question, who built the pyramids? It's a message in a bottle. It's something that tells us something really, really strange has gone on here. Think about it. Try to work out what has been going on. Because if we are ever going to understand what we are going to have to do, which is going back in time 4.6 billion years and building the moon, we have to have these messages from the past which keep us looking. Otherwise, we may get so busy concerning ourselves with the mundane elements of life, or strictly with religious elements of life, that we may never lift our eyes from the ground and say, look at that moon, that is really weird. How can it possibly just exactly cover the face of the sun? That's just too ludicrous for words. But this is pointed at by all the other weird things that have happened in the past, which are equally impossible, but are possible if intervention from the future took place. So the pyramid is really a message in a bottle. But I hope it's explained much better in the book. Time is always difficult when you're giving a talk. Yes, sir.
I don't know if you spoke about this earlier, but about Göbekli Tepe.
Yes.
Have you actually been there?
No, I haven't. It's one of the places that I really, really want to go. And again, it's one of those instances, it's completely out of time, you know? There is nothing in the world. Göbekli Tepe is a really, truly ancient monument. But it's so far back in time that it's utterly preposterous. It just shouldn't be there. And I think we get these messages in bottles occurring all over the world. It's one of the places I really want to go. It looks astounding.
What's the place?
Gülbeki Tepe. It's
Where is
in Turkey. Yeah. It makes Stonehenge look like children's building blocks in comparison.
It's got 3D carvings, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's got 3D carvings on it from an era many thousands of years before any stone was lifted into place anywhere in Western Europe, when it has generally been considered that we were still walking around in animal skins and bagging the rocks together. You know, I mean, it's never been considered that there was a culture at that stage in history that was capable of building anything like that.